Part of the barrier for myself as an athlete was I had accessibility to the game. My family could afford it, but even in doing so, I still could never comfortably be my full, genuine self for fear of misrepresenting or being too distant of a familiar palette for those I'm actually trying to impress.
Kids of all colors, and they got the Matthews and Marner and Nylander, Tavares jerseys on their back. They are in love with this game just as much as everybody else. It's great that the Next Gen initiative is letting everybody know that, like, hey, you guys are part of us.
A lot of these times we have these conversations and it's very centered on race and the diversity and inclusivity that we're speaking on. Make sure you include the gay community. You got to include everybody, and diversity isn't just about race.
Scott, okay, you are now doing this podcast, the Breaking Barriers podcast, and you've been around the building, not lately, but for a few years now, and you've heard so many stories of even work staff, being victims of racism, and you already shared a story here. What has been one of your biggest takeaways for promoting Black history and hockey in the podcast? And maybe what has been something that's shaken you in those stories?
The lack of anger is what just really drove this podcast, is the fact that these guys just want to tell their story. Yeah. Talk about what happened to them, be like very concise about it, not gloss over the details, but at the same time, not hold a grudge. I find that very refreshing. And I think that's exactly the right way to approach this and the right way to make change.
Back to you, Kryshanda, your grandfather, the third Black player in the NHL. I mean, I'm sure he's got stories for you. I'm sure there's things that you learned from him through the process. What were some of those things that you learned from your grandfather after he faced adversity? I'm sure he's shared that you now bring into your coaching career.
Yeah, he has a really unique way of storytelling where you don't essentially focus on the negative. You see the perseverance of it all. And so a lot of his stories, he would teach me hockey. He teaches me hockey, and we talk hockey. And then, he would share an excerpt or a little story about something racist that would happen to him. And it would be awful. These stories are terrible. You ask him, well, what'd you do about it? And it was like, I got dressed and played the game and stuff. And so a lot of the lessons I get from him is to just, pick myself up and keep going, because I can't allow those moments to define me. And so that's what I bring with me moving forward. Like, racism is not going to get me out of the game. So no matter how hard it pushes or tries, that's not what's going to break me down and take me away from the game. And all those stories, like knowing what he went through and how he was paving the way and what he had to deal with, it inspired me to help pave the way, especially on the women's side. And it's just so important that there is that connection, that legacy of constantly pushing and breaking ceilings if we have to, but not allowing it to define me in any capacity.
Mark, you've now got this new role. You've got a long road ahead of you. What are some things that you want to start when it comes to equity, inclusion, and diversity within your role?
First and foremost would be, ideating and creating the strategy in which we're going to create new understanding and education for our players and for our staff. Internally starting to inwards and building outwards. Again, what I mentioned earlier is part of the motivation is trying to, be at the helm of creating that growth of knowledge and that understanding of new perspectives. That's something that's incredibly important to me, because through that, we can then continue to build advocacy through our players, through our organization, and then start to channel that more so outwardly as well. It's important that we need to continue to strengthen the relationships to different minority communities, whether that be the queer community, to female community, to the racialized community, whatever it may be, because we already have fans in those communities, but there's such a disconnect and a distance. So it's not like we're necessarily trying to go get all these new fans, although in some manner, we would be, because we just want to grow our game. But at the same time, we already have fans in these communities, but we need to grow the relationship so that, for one, they can see and feel their own representation in the game of hockey. But at the same time, just let it be known that you're on the Maple Leafs radar, that the TML is working in actionable ways, not just in, with words, but with actual intent. We are working to strengthen those relationships so that, again, with no arbitrary restrictions, a young Asian family can feel like they can attend a Maple Leafs game just as comfortably as they can attend a Raptors game, and so on and so forth. So that's a lot of the driving factor here is knowing that right off the bat, I want to be able to continue to grow that education and then be part of the driving force to be engaged in our community and to strengthen those relationships with people who otherwise just feel disconnected from the club.
But how do we start to take down those barriers when it comes to youth actually signing up for hockey?
Well, it's challenging. I mean, there's no simple way to take down barriers that have been that are part of the foundation. Whether, again, it's social economic barriers is one of the biggest challenges of hockey because of its affordability and obviously the lack of communities who can't afford it. That being said, there's a lot of minorities who absolutely can afford it, but they just don't feel like it's a welcoming environment for other barriers and other restrictions. So again, a large part of it comes from representation. Part of the barrier for myself as an athlete was I had accessibility to the game. My family could afford it. I had the opportunity to play and eventually get into competitive hockey and then grow from there until I became pro. But even in doing so at the pro level, as I mentioned, I still could never comfortably be my full genuine self for fear of misrepresenting or being too distant of a familiar palette for those I'm actually trying to impress. And that's one of the biggest barriers, I think, for myself that I want to help combat is by placing a Black superior, whether that be a coach, whether that be a GM or a president or scouts or whoever that may be, there's familiarity there. So it's not, again, just like to be woke enough where we have Black people who work for us, but to allow the opportunity to grow. Because you could have 4 Black people play on the same team in the NHL level, and they'll still just kind of stay connected to themselves because they are going to be what's familiar in and amongst themselves. And without having that representation further up the chain so that we can realize for no, again, arbitrary restriction, I can get this opportunity. I can be provided that opportunity. And hopefully that has a trickle down effect. But that's some of the biggest barrier challenges. It comes from, again, the people who have the ability to make decisions or to influence the game, being able to see that different lens, the importance of having unique perspectives being brought to the table to allow these different voices to be heard, slowly can create change in a lot of different barriers, whether, again, that's social economic or if it's just the opportunities to grow or not being, if you're a victim of a racial slur on the ice, to know that the victim will be protected more than the perpetrator will be protected from us trying to keep a squeaky clean image of our game. Those are the types of barriers that are preventing a lot of racialized groups from wanting to join hockey. And so that's some of the ways that we can try to combat that, from representation from the top down, sympathizing and understanding the uniqueness and the struggle sometimes of these perspectives, so that we have a different type of awareness so that we can be more conscious of the challenges that some of our peers face.
Scott, you've had the opportunity to be at quite a few next gen games, which is all focusing on youth, getting them into the arena and taking it to equity in hockey at the grassroots level. How do you think at games like that, we really get kids and youth excited about hockey as a whole, but then as well, kind of them wanting to be a part of the game?
It's a real thing because Toronto is, we all call it the biggest melting pot of Canada, obviously, maybe of the world. And, the experiment of figuring this out is kind of ongoing. And the MLC Foundation is literally case and proven, shown that kids want to get involved in this game. Look at the Regent Park facility that we built in Regent Park, where people thought nobody's ever going to skate there. Well, look at it. Are you kidding me? It's packed. I can't even get on the ice there.
You can't skate, Scott.
I can't get up. I live in the area, man. I can't get on the ice. So it's packed out there. So it's great. No, obviously you can see the kids come out, and it's Toronto. It's the most multicultural city in Canada and maybe in the world. And kids of all colors, and they got the Matthews and Marner and Nylander, Tavares jerseys on their back. They are in love with this game just as much as everybody else is. And that's great that the Next Gen initiative is letting everybody know that, like, hey, you guys are part of us. And I want to go back to Mark's point, because what Mark says is really good. It's not just black and white. It's all races, the indigenous community, the Asian community. And I think MLSE is doing a fantastic job. I mean, Amanda, look at your co-host. Joey, I'm pretty sure is a Filipino over there. And we got a black guy, a half black guy, who's a main host for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Name another team in the NHL who does that. So I think we're on the front step here.
Now, to close out this conversation, I could talk to you guys all day, but I know your time is precious. Keeping these conversations at the forefront and in frequency. Kryshanda, what are your biggest takeaways from today's conversation? Or if that's not something, what is like the one thing you want someone to leave knowing and thinking about?
A lot of these times we have these conversations and we get into these developments on how we want to grow the game. And it's very centered on race and the diversity and inclusivity that we're speaking on. Make sure you include the gay community. You got to include everybody. And diversity isn't just about race. It's about, everybody's different walks of life and the adversity they all have to face. So my last thing would just be it's not just about race as well. It's also about those other communities that are being overlooked as well.
I mean, I think that's a great sentiment from Kryshanda. It's about to fully, you can't have inclusion without diversity and vice versa. But diversity, again, it's not, I know what it's like from the lens of a biracial Black hockey player, but I don't know what it's like from the lens of the Asian community or Indigenous community or East Indian community, nor would I from the female or the disabled or the queer community. But that's truly what diversity is. And hockey is a great game where all these different demographics are very much can be and should be part of the game. But it's continuing to focus our conversations in that vein. Again, I can speak on the struggles for Black athletes in hockey because that's been my experience and I'm happy to do so. But it's also to be for myself to even be aware that it's beyond just my own experience and to practice what I'm actually preaching. It's to also be aware and to continue to educate myself on the rest of the marginalized groups in and around our sport that for whatever reason maybe haven't been able to be represented or feel overly welcome. Because if we truly want hockey to be the inclusive game, Canada's game, our game, then it needs to be, again, for no arbitrary restriction available to anyone and everyone. So as we continue to work through that, that's one of my biggest takeaways from this chat.
My takeaways are Kryshanda needs to have a podcast because I want to hear more of her thoughts.
Yes.
Definitely want that.
I agree with that.
Also, I know that we're in good hands with Mark because Mark has a good vision and he's not going to let up until that happens.
Well, I can't thank you guys all enough. Thank you so much for being here, opening this conversation. I know I'm going to take a lot away from this, and I think that everyone across the Toronto Maple Leafs nation will as well.